Welcome everybody to this Perpetrator Studies Network book launch. My name is Susanne Knittel, and together with Timothy Williams, I have been organizing the New Books in Perpetrator Studies series, which is now actually in its third year already. It's been going strong and going for a while. And we're of course absolutely delighted to have a fantastic panel today. First, maybe a word about the network. The Perpetrator Studies Network is an international and interdisciplinary network of scholars and educators whose research centers on perpetrators and perpetration of genocide, mass killings, and political violence. It provides a forum for scholarly discussions about and also innovative research into perpetration across historical, geographic, and cultural lines. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome for today's event the editors of the Oxford Handbook on Atrocity Crimes. And with us is Hollie, Nyseth, and Nzitatira, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at The Ohio State University and is a specialist on Rwanda and is currently working on two projects examining the Gacaca courts and the reintegration processes of those sentenced to prison by these courts. We also have Barbora, Holá, who is Associate Professor of Criminal Law and Criminology at the Free University in Amsterdam and a Senior Researcher at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement. And Barbora investigates in her research international criminal justice processes, societal reconstruction after atrocities, and the etiology of collective violence. And we also have Maartje Weerdesteijn, who is assistant professor also at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam at the Department of Criminal Law and Criminology. And her research centers on dictators and how they orchestrate mass atrocities and the responsibility of the international community in mitigating these crimes. Now, Hollie is going to be our moderator for the evening, and I'm happy to hand over the mic to her. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Suzanne and Tim, for having us be part of this fascinating network and for including our book in your book launch series. We're just really grateful, and we're grateful to all of you for joining us no matter what time. I know some of us are, lunchtime, it's evening, it's breakfast time for others. So thank you for being here with us. Just to give you a quick overview of our time together, we're going to start with a brief overview of the book, and I'll turn the Zoom floor over to Barbora Holá for that shortly. At that point in time, we'll have presentations, roughly 10-minute presentations from 4 of the authors included in the handbook, presentations that, of course, will tie in to themes of perpetration. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So if a question comes up, feel free to put it in the chat. Otherwise, you can unmute your mic at the end when we have Q&A, but feel free to keep them coming in throughout. With that, I'll introduce everyone before they speak. So for now, I will turn it over to Barbora to give an overview of the handbook.
Well, thank you so much, Hollie, and let me join you in thanking Suzanne and Timothy for having us and organizing this event. Thank you also to all the presenters who were willing to take an hour and a half of their time and be here with us. We are very, very excited about it. And I am here to say just a couple of words about the handbook. And the journey of the handbook has been a long one, actually. I think that we started to brainstorm about the book like 5 years ago or 6 years ago, I'm not sure. And back in the time, we were actually thinking that, there has been so much written about genocide, so much written about war crimes or crimes against humanity. But we thought that the scholarship is lacking a volume which actually synthesizes all these 3 crimes in one, contrasts and compares these categories of crimes. So that was actually one of our aims, to come up with a comprehensive volume which covers different crimes, but also different aspects of their commission. The second aim was to come up with a volume which is comparative, So not only comparing the different crimes, but also comparing them across the different contexts and different conflicts and different situations where these atrocities are committed. And in addition to this, also across different disciplines. Because so far the scholarship had been actually very scattered, I would say. Different disciplines sort of operated within their own silos. So we were aiming to sort of provide, in a way, comprehensive and comparative overview. And finally, I think that we were aiming to provide a synthesis. So we wanted to synthesize existing knowledge, but also open new windows and ask each contributing author to come up with questions which were not yet answered in the scholarship. So this is how this came into being. It's a book of almost 1,000 pages. There are, I think, 38 chapters written by 50 authors. And you can find there many different topics approached from cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary angles. One actually part of the book deals with actors in atrocity crimes, which is, I think, the most relevant part for this network, where perpetration is discussed and will be presented here today. The other parts also deal with terminology, methodologies, causes of atrocity crimes, reaction to atrocity crimes, harm and victims of atrocity crimes. And the book sort of concludes with a couple of case studies where we aimed to sort of collect case studies which are perhaps not so much discussed in the scholarship. So there is a case study on Angola, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Guatemala, Iraq, or Colombia. So I think there is a lot of in there, a lot of food for thought as well. So, and I think that today the presentations will show how proud we are of this baby of ours, I would say. So thank you so much once more for having us.
Thank you so much, Barbora. So now we'll hear from the authors themselves, and we're going to start with a presentation from Dr. Erin Jessee. So Erin Jessee is a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow. She has over a decade of experience conducting qualitative fieldwork in conflict-affected areas, particularly Rwanda, Bosnia, and Uganda. She is the author of Negotiating Genocide in Rwanda, The Politics of History, and she has also published a number of articles. Some of the notable journals include Memory Studies, Conflict in History, History in Africa, Oral History Review, and Forensic Science International, among others. Dr. Jessee's chapter in the volume is titled On the Margins, Role Shifting in Atrocity Crimes, and I turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you, Holly, for the introduction. And yeah, thank you to the editors for putting this whole volume together. It's an impressive task. You don't realize until you're actually physically holding the book on your hands just how massive it was, and just, yeah, and you put up with us as well as authors. So thank you for that. And thank you also to the organizers of the Perpetrator Studies Network for having us today. Yeah, so the chapter that I'm working on, as Holly mentioned, is focusing on this issue of role shifting that can occur amid atrocity crimes. And so essentially what I'm doing in this chapter is I'm looking at the example of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in which an estimated 500,000 to 1 million members of the nation's ethnic Tutsi minority were murdered by Hutu power extremists and their supporters. And I'm one of a handful of people who've tried to do research in Rwanda that goes across different lines of the conflict, of the genocide. So depending on, sort of the day, the time, I've spent time working in the prisons with people who've been convicted of genocide-related crimes. But there's also been moments where I've worked with people who are very sort of clearly defined, both in their own terms and by others, as survivors, people who are also defined as former combatants, and this kind of thing. And Rwanda, of course, is quite an important case study because in many ways, in the sort of almost 30 years since the genocide now, it's become incredibly significant, both for the field of genocide studies, but also for the field of perpetrator studies as it pertains to the perpetration of genocide. And of course, this is largely due to the massively impactful research of scholars like Scott Strauss, Leanne Fuji, Charles Maronko, Omar McDoon, Hollie Nyseth, Nzitatira, sorry, Hollie, I always want to go back. who have in various ways used qualitative methods to understand how perpetrators of the genocide and other key actors, of course, make sense of their crimes, and also how their criminal actions have affected their lives in the years since the genocide as a result, most notably, of their experiences within Rwanda's very ambitious transitional justice program. So there's a huge amount of literature on this. But of course, my chapter in this edited volume is trying to take a slightly different and potentially more controversial, I think definitely more controversial at times, approach to this subject of perpetration. And I'm doing this by looking at how individuals who've been clearly identified by the state, by organizations, and often by the general public, as fitting within these archetypes that exist within the official history on the 1984 genocide in Rwanda. And these are archetypes relating to what I call the innocent survivor, the heroic ex-combatant, and then, of course, the guilty perpetrator. And these in Rwanda, much as they are in other parts of the world where we're dealing with genocide-affected contexts, these are categories that are often seen as being very sort of strictly delineated and often diametrically opposed to each other. And yet, you know, in working with people who served different roles relative to the genocide and likewise were affected by the genocide in different ways, I've often become aware of the fact that these nicely delineated categories don't apply to a lot of Rwandans' lived experiences of the genocide. And I came to this realization through the kinds of research that I've done in the country, working not only across different lines to the conflict, but also using sort of oral historical and ethnographic methods. Since I first started working in Rwanda in 2007, I've conducted multiple interviews with well over 100 Rwandans from different perspectives on the genocide. And this kind of comprehensive approach then exposed me to narratives from a number of different people that showed that at different points in time during the genocide and as well around surrounding forms of political violence in the country, a lot of Rwandans actually moved between these categories. They might be sort of victimized and survive an attack in one moment, but then in the next moment, maybe a few days later, or even later on in the same day, you know, they might be serving as a bystander, and then they might take on the role of a perpetrator or take on the role of a combatant and so on. And so what I'm trying to explore in this chapter is the way that Rwandans could sometimes move between these categories. And one of the reasons that I do this is because these archetypes that exist in the Rwandan context, while they can sometimes be very useful, very appropriate for Rwandans, there are also moments where the moral judgment that comes along with these archetypes can actually start to cause people substantial emotional distress, because they feel that these moral judgments, whether they're positive or negative, are somehow being applied to them in a way that leaves them feeling a degree of discomfort. It doesn't quite match, you know, what they've lived and what they've been through. And so for this reason, one of the things I try to do in this chapter is put forward this idea of using the concept of complex political actor. And here I'm drawing upon the work of political scientists Erica Burris and Erin Baines, to try, at least as a starting point for research design, a starting point for analysis, to look at these people through a lens that doesn't come with this moral judgment, this automatic moral judgment on what they are about, what their experiences were about, and so on. And this doesn't necessarily mean that that's where I end up in analyzing their life history narratives, right? Some of the people I interviewed clearly were survivors and I think innocent in a lot of ways. Other people, you know, very clearly guilty perpetrators and so on. But for a lot of people, this framing allowed me to, first of all, approach them with this reduced moral judgment. And second of all, allowed me to then better explore the kind of fuller spectrum of their experiences and of their actions in this genocide. And I should note as well that in adopting this approach and as putting this forward as an approach that other people working in similar types of contexts might want to use, I am not advocating that people's actions in these contexts necessarily be taken as morally or legally equivalent. Again, I think sometimes we need to end up with the understanding that these people have committed crimes and are guilty and so on. But instead, what I'm trying to do is argue for a more sensitive approach that takes into consideration people's life histories and other information to sort of establish and analyze the broader spectrum of their actions, and hopefully be able to then push back against these overly simplistic and sometimes psychologically harmful narratives that tend to circulate in post-genocide settings relating to these ideas of, people being purely innocent or, firmly guilty and so on. And so obviously today I don't have time to go into the narratives that I explore in the chapter in any detail, but what I do is I then go into 3 different life histories. One, an individual who was very clearly by others at least defined as an innocent survivor, and I show how that judgment, that label came to affect him negatively, because of course there are moments in the genocide where he did things that he then was left feeling as though he was in no way innocent. In this context. The second narrative that I then look at relates to somebody who was identified very much as a heroic ex-combatant. And in that one as well, I show that there were moments in his actions in the Civil War period in Rwanda and later in the genocide where he began to feel as though he really didn't deserve the label of a hero. And indeed, there may have been moments where he and others like him crossed the border into perpetrator and so on. And then finally, the final case study that I'm looking at for the life history narrative is an individual who was very clearly defined as a guilty perpetrator. And yet he too had engaged in moments where he tried, or at least he claimed to have tried to rescue people and in other ways had been victimized himself. And so he too found that this label seemed to kind of oversimplify just how complicated the genocide for him was, as somebody who he claimed had acted mostly in under duress and committing crimes, and more often had tried to really help people during this period. So I think with that, I'm pretty much at my 10 minutes, so I'll stop there, but happy to discuss any of these themes more in the question period. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Erin. And let me just add to, these narratives are so well written. So the chapter is truly just wonderful to read. So I absolutely suggest reading this chapter. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Myriam Denov. So Myriam Denov is professor at McGill University and holds the Canada Research Chair in Youth, Gender, and Armed Conflict. Her research interests lie in the areas of children and families affected by war, migration, and its international impact. She is the author, well, actually, she is the author of over 13, or I believe 13 books and edited volumes and over 160 articles and book chapters and reports. So far too many to pull out here, but to pull out 2. She's the author of Child Soldiers, Sierra Leone's Revolutionary United Front, and co-editor of Children Affected by Armed Conflict, Theory, Method, and Practice. And her chapter specifically looks at child soldiers.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's really amazing to be here and to finally at least see many of the people that I've been communicating with for years. I want to congratulate the editors for being so tenacious and getting us through all of the hurdles of COVID and the complexities around editing such a large volume. It weighs a ton, so it is very impressive. And thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me. I'm happy to talk today about the issue of children. And I think that Erin raised so many excellent and important issues that have a lot of bearing on my chapter as well, and what I address in my chapter, particularly as it pertains to children. And I think when we think about perpetrator studies, it is a very sort of dichotomized way of looking at it. And I think that particularly for child soldiers who are potentially perpetrators, they're also victims, they're also resistors of violence, and they're also witnesses of violence. So the chapter was really trying to get at going into that complexity and also sort of unpacking some of the representations in popular media that we have of child soldiers and the implications of that. So today I'm just going to kind of give a very broad overview of the broad strokes of my chapter, and to ultimately highlight the complexity of lives of child soldiers and to kind of really challenge many of the binaries that are attached to understandings of child soldiers. So we know it's very difficult to determine the numbers of children that are involved and implicated in armed conflict as child soldiers, given the context of war, the difficulty in attaining reliable statistics. But we do know from the United Nations that over 60 non-state and state armed forces are recruiting children most recently. And these children play a multiplicity of roles, whether it's fighters in combat, whether it's being messengers, spies, medics, caregivers to younger children, domestic servants, and in some cases, sexually exploited within the context of these armed groups. And when we first sort of began to get attention on the issue of child soldiers, the focus was really on largely on sub-Saharan Africa. But we know that the vast majority of armed groups and forces that are recruiting children are now spread across North Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, and South and Southeast Asia. And despite, I mean, one of the things to also keep in mind is the many legal protections that are in place for children to prevent their participation in any kind of armed conflict, whether it's the Geneva Conventions, the CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, the Rome Statute. I could go on and list them. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that despite these legal protections, that the violations, human rights violations of children and their abduction and participation in armed conflict continues. One of the things that I address in the chapter is sort of what are children's experiences during conflict and what are some of their experiences afterwards. And so I'll just highlight a few points around during conflict. And just to give a sense of what does it mean to be a child soldier in the context of war. And this draws on my sort of work in Sierra Leone and during and following the war, as well as in northern Uganda, as well as in Colombia as well. And I mean, I think to really understand is to understand that the daily culture of violence that surrounds these children on an ongoing basis. And violence, I mean physical violence, sexual violence, psychological violence, ongoing fear, and being in context of these military hierarchies, which very young children obviously have been, regardless of whether they have been forced into an armed group or an armed situation, or whether they have joined. The being away from family potentially and being without a guardian or a parent has huge implications for their daily lives. The lack of food, lack of healthcare, having their education disrupted, and the idea of within the context of an armed group being simultaneously, and I think Erin really outlined this beautifully, but the complexity of what it means to be both a victim, a perpetrator, and a witness simultaneously, especially for a child. So many of the children that I've worked with talk about the fact that they were forced to commit horrible atrocities. They were witnesses of atrocities committed by others, and they were at the same time victims of atrocities. And so one of the powerful things that they spoke about in the aftermath of the conflict was, how do I deal with this? How do I accept myself? How do I forgive myself for what I did? How can I forgive myself for the harms that I did to others? And what I witnessed. And I think for many children that I worked with, when they're in the conflict, things are happening so quickly around them that they don't have the time to really reflect on what the meaning of that is. But it's only in the aftermath that they really begin to struggle of what they did and the implications. I want to also emphasize the invisibility of girls within the context of child soldiers and the discussions around child soldiers and how much they're marginalized, both even within academic discussions. I think it's, gaining much more traction and understanding, but particularly in war's aftermath and how they're often forgotten and ignored. The reality of the fact that although girls are sort of forgotten and marginalized, they're really considered vital to the functioning of armed groups. And that's why we often see that girls are the last members of, child soldiers to be released, because they are so valuable for their ongoing domestic work and their functioning within the armed groups. I want to also just highlight that in the aftermath of the war, the often stigma and rejection and marginalization of these young people on a long-term basis from their families, from their larger communities. So these children are, often told by DDR programmers, those who are, helping to reintegrate in the aftermath of the war, go back to your families, go back to your communities. They're waiting for you. They're going to be very happy to see you. And these children return to their communities where they're shunned, rejected, and left to basically make their way on their own. And I think one of the things that I also address in the chapter is the sort of, despite the complexity of these children's experiences, how these children are often perceived in the popular media as within these very narrow confines as either dangerous and disorderly, the sort of pathology attached to a dangerous child soldier. And here we have an example of, many of you may have heard of Omar Khadr, who was a Canadian who was in Afghanistan and ended up killing an American soldier, and his treatment, and he was in Guantanamo Bay for almost a decade. And the depiction of him as compared to the other sort of realm of the hero, for example, Ismail Bea, who is a former child soldier from Sierra Leone, and his memoir was publicized very much by Starbucks, and he was treated in a very different way as this sort of romanticized hero who had come through armed conflict and violence and had been sort of restored as this, in a very romanticized, heroic fashion. The other depiction is, these unidimensional victims of conflict as well, and the vast invisibility of girls within these dichotomies. So ultimately, all of these portrayals fail to depict the complexity of children's experiences, and their experiences that are often essentialized, decontextualized, and rendered completely unidimensional. And I think that all of those sort of formulaic imagery just speaks to the reality that we don't have the language to adequately represent the complexity of children who are involved in armed conflict and what that means. The last point that I'm just going to raise is in relation to in response in a way to these portrayals of these children as dangerous and disorderly and all of those kinds of conceptualizations. And that research really tells us that, in fact, these children are not doomed to life of crimes or to be, continually traumatized by their realities, that they ultimately become and can become caring, productive adults and leaders in their communities. And we've seen this over and over again. So the realities and experiences of these children challenge the very dichotomies that are that shape these public views of them. So that's, I think I've definitely gone over, sorry. Anyway, that's what I wanted to highlight today. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Myriam. And as you all heard, this chapter, much like Erin's chapter, really shows that many of the categories and binaries that are so often used in our field of study are too oversimplified. So it's another reason that these chapters are among my favorite chapters in the volume, as that was a theme that we had really wanted to try to pull out throughout the volume. So thank you so much for sharing that. We will move now to a different topic tied to perpetration, and that is specifically corporate crime. So our next speaker is Dr. Annika van Baar, and she is assistant professor at the Faculty of Law at VU Amsterdam. She is trained as a criminologist, and she specializes in corporate involvement in international crimes and gross human rights violations, as well as the global regulation of business and human rights. So essentially, she is interested in how and why corporations become involved in international crimes, the dynamics between corporations, states, and NGOs, and how we can use knowledge on corporate wrongdoing to improve prevention of corporate harm. And of course, as you can likely surmise, her chapter addresses the involvement of corporations in atrocity crimes. So I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Holly. And also I want to echo Myriam and Erin with their thanks to both the network and of course the editors for their great work on the book. I will just explain to you a little bit what the chapter was about. I have it here because it was quite a long time ago, so I'm going to peek a little bit. And I'm actually the third author on this chapter. I wrote it together with Wim Huisman and Suzanne Karstedt. We were very happy that we were able to contribute this chapter, speaking of about an often neglected type of perpetrator in the study of atrocity crimes or international crimes, the corporation. And it's interesting actually that this actor has been neglected by the field because when you think about the Nuremberg tribunals, which have a lot to do with the development of international criminal law and then the study by various disciplines of international criminal law, we also know that there were a couple of managers and owners of large German companies who were prosecuted at the subsequent Nuremberg trials. This is also where our chapter starts, by tracing a little bit how attention for corporate roles in atrocity crimes has increased mostly since the 1990s, but there was also a spike during the anti-apartheid movement, where there was also a strong emphasis on the role of business and business relations between the US, European countries, and then South Africa, the apartheid regime. So we trace that a little bit in the introduction and the first part of the chapter. And then I think we contribute a nice discussion about how when we study corporations as actors in atrocity crimes, we study collective actors in collective crimes, which, as you can imagine, makes things very complicated quite quickly. But I think we managed to highlight a couple of interesting points there. And for me personally, this is also why I love studying this type of perpetrator. I like complicated things, I guess. And then we move to the part of the chapter where we draw upon a database that we've been maintaining now for over 10 years, in which we try to document as much information as we have available on any accusation against a company about involvement in genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes. So we rely fully on accusations made by others. These are mostly NGOs, but sometimes also scholars. And in some cases, the accusation is immediately a court case. We have gathered all of these cases and formalized what kind of information we gathered about them, and eventually managed to even build a quantitative database coding various variables on for all of these cases. And in the chapter, we are therefore able to trace some first patterns. Some of them we already knew, some were more surprising. For example, in time, where we see a lot of cases during the Second World War, then a dip. Then during the 1970s and 80s, we see a spike. Tracing, of course, what I started my talk with. And we also see very clearly that it's mostly corporations who are headquartered in the global north that are involved in atrocities in the global south. This is a bit of a well-known fact in the field also of business and human rights, but now we have the empirical data also to see what that looks like and how it looks like over time. So we try to say something about the different types of crimes that corporations become involved in. We see that often there's an overlap, so it's not just genocide, but it's genocide and crimes against humanity. Also a big overlap between crimes against humanity and war crimes, which makes a lot of sense because corporations, not always, but very often become involved in atrocity crimes through their presence on the ground. And then when war crimes and crimes against humanity are committed, they can become involved in both. We try to say a little bit about prevalence, but of course this is very difficult because we don't know the dark number, and we've made ourselves dependent on accusations by third parties, which is, I think, also the only way to study this, because if we would have to give our own labels to everything, that would be very difficult and difficult to maintain consistency in applying those levels. And now what we have, we have a bias in the database, of course, because some cases are more likely to be picked up by NGOs or journalists or lawyers to make the accusation. But it's also a bias that gives us information about how this is becoming a more and more a topic that also the general public cares about. And I think nowadays we really see this happening with the attention. When I teach students now, they all know about the links between garment companies such as Nike and H&M and crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang in China. And also when the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion took place, immediately in the news there was an emphasis on the responsibility of businesses in Europe. So that's an interesting point, I think, that we are able to show a little bit in the chapter as well. Then after the overview of the types of crimes and also the types of branches and types of products that companies become involved through, that's in the book, I'm not going to go through all of that. We try to use the idea of crime scripts to pick up some trends in what we see, what types of different types of involvement we can distinguish. One very clear one is that we see that direct involvement of corporations, so corporations directly taking part in murder or any of the other categories of the core crimes, is very rare. It happens, but it's not the bulk of the involvement is indirect. For example, as a buyer of certain products or as a supplier of goods and services. And that's what we go into in the third part of the chapter. And we end with two case studies, one about Nazi Germany and one about the DRC, depicting one context of a repressive regime and another context of conflict. And also another contrast between the two is that in Nazi Germany, corporations were mostly involved because they were in the area where the crimes took place. And in the DRC, a lot of companies were involved through supply chains. So that's a very different dynamic of involvement. And I think that's, that summarizes the chapter, or at least shows you what the chapter is about. We're still working with the database. We get more and more new cases every year, also indicating that I think mostly the attention for corporate actors is on the search, but also I think there might be an increase of conflict over the past few years, which also explains the spike. But we will continue to work on this also together with Wim Huisman and Suzanne Karstedt and hopefully, yeah, and I really like how this chapter is really just the foundation of all the work we've done over the past year. So, yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I should also point out that Annika has been at the forefront of this research. As you've heard, this is relatively understudied, it's growing in interest, but there's a fantastic article she wrote that was published in 2012 in the British Journal of Criminology on the oven builders of the Holocaust. And my students read it every time I teach global criminology and love the article, but I think it also shows how long she has been working on this and all of the wealth of knowledge that you can find in this chapter. So with that, we have one more speaker. So last but not least is Dr. Nicole Fox. I should note that she teaches in about 18 minutes, so she will speak and will not be around for Q&A. And her chapter broadens the lens even further to memorialization. So for a quick introduction, Dr. Fox studies how racial and ethnic contention impacts communities, including how remembrances of adversity shape social change, collective memory, and present-day social movements. She is an associate professor of criminal justice at California State University, Sacramento. Most notably, her 2021 book, After Genocide, Memory and Reconciliation in Genocide, focuses on the memorials that shape healing, community development, and reconciliation in Rwanda. She has published work in a plethora of journals, so just to give you a couple of them, she has recent work in social problems, signs, social forces, deviant behavior, and many others. So with that, obviously her chapter is on memory and memorialization of atrocities, and I turn the Zoom floor over to Nikki.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry I'm not able to stay for the Q&A, but thank you so much for having me. And I'm so grateful for the editors too. And also to all the other panelists. It's really an honor to be in such good company of such brilliant folks. So today I'll just really quickly give you an overview, talk a little bit about the collective memory literature, and then some key lessons and insights, especially as it relates to perpetrator studies. So in this chapter, I try to define memorialization and define it as both a process and an outcome. So something that people do, but something that also often results in memorials, museums, public spaces of commemoration. And to situate this, there really has been a social change turning towards memorializing rather than these monuments. And so that's been really interesting and pretty important to atrocity crimes. So for example, in the past, you saw a lot of sculptures or monuments of folks from wars, but not these kind of more somber spaces commemorating atrocities. Hopefully what these are, and when they're done really well, they're very trauma-informed and trauma-centered, so that there's a recognition of what is memorialized in the people who have survived those atrocities. And I argue in this chapter and in my other work, and I think that's become more of a accepted notion, is that memorials actually are part of this transitional justice process, and that they work best with other transitional justice initiatives. So they can work in tandem really well with truth commissions, with courts, actually, reparations, a number of different traditional transitional justice. And so we see all of these different types of transitional justice, and memorialization is often one that can work with these. So if you see that there's reparations, one of those reparations might indeed be a memorial. Memorials can also sometimes house social services as a form of justice for the survivors. They can also hold spaces as places in which perpetrators and so-called victims or so-called perpetrators, as Erin's work notes, these categories are much more blurry than we often assume. And so these spaces can sometimes be sites where those conversations or truth-like commission processes can occur. So the idea of memorialization really comes out of this collective memory literature and sociology. And what it is that the past can be socially constructed. And so our perspectives of the past can change over time. We saw this with Holocaust museums and memorials in particular, where in the 60s, there were really only memorials to those in the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and then slowly as we got more information about what that process was like, and as victims were able to tell their stories, these memorials changed their shape to become more inclusive. But what we do know is that in order for a society, at least on a national level, to have these kind of quote unquote collective memories, they have to be narrated to be remembered. So there's a storytelling process in those. And this narrative is really important. And the narrative is often shaped by those who are in positions of power, but also resisted by those who don't always have the social access to resources that those powerful institutions. And some have called these contested memories or counter memories. And so in terms of memorialization, who it serves is there's definitely ways in which they serve individuals. And so I talk a little bit about this in my chapter, in that it provides oftentimes a site of healing for some of the folks who have individuals who are buried at that memorial. It also sometimes can be a site of social networking, which is really interesting between members of the society. As a community, it can bring community members together. It can also bring in a workforce and financial opportunities. And then nationwide, memorials definitely serve a purpose, both in nationalism and ideas of citizenship. They can also be used to consolidate power of an administration or a regime. So they really function on these multiple levels. Memorialization really came out in these what I call the three braided trends historically, and that's the memory boom. And so the memory boom was this time when social scientists, there was a book that was republished, and social scientists started becoming really fascinated with memory. This is also when we think of memorial mania. So all of a sudden, all these memorials start popping up everywhere. And you see this huge shift in the way that we think about memory. And at the same time that that's happening, the contemporary human rights movement is exploding. So you're seeing Amnesty International getting this huge recognition. You're starting to think about having human rights discourse be really part of the vernacular. And so those things are happening, as well as the justice cascade, which I'm sure many folks here know, but this idea that victims now have rights, that the state is the perpetrator, can be a perpetrator, that victims have the rights to truth. And so these things are really coming in at a time that that memorialization is really shifting, and also shifting in terms of its political and social power. So just to go straight into the key lessons, one of the key lessons that I found in my research on memorials after mass atrocity, especially looking at Rwanda, but also cases throughout the US and throughout the continent of Africa, is that they are indeed, when done right and inclusive for survivors, they do provide some validation to survivors. And survivors talk about the cognitive dissonance of what it was like to experience such killings of people they knew, of their family members. Anyone who's experienced any type of significant grief knows how crazy making that can be, and that these spaces really validated their experiences. When these spaces talked about sexual assault or sexual and gender-based violence, that was especially important for the women survivors of that. I have to note that isn't done very often. And so that is something that I think is on the forefront of talking about memorialization and memory studies. Also narratives, and this goes into my last couple of slides about why this is important to perpetrator studies, but these narratives actually become quite powerful at these. Some of the memorials and the commemorations, which are the actual events of memory making happening at these sites, are spaces in which very, very powerful people attend. So VIPs and as heads of state, but also donors, also folks, and then also every day. And so this importance of making space for people to share their stories becomes really important, because then a lot of times these commemorations become literally the written history of what happened during these atrocities, as these events are transcribed and videotaped and shown for the world to see. And so survivors talk about the need, and Elie Wiesel also talked about this, the need to have these receivers of memory, these people who hear the stories. And the survivors that I interviewed really wanted perpetrators to be active in this, to hear their memories. And it wasn't to shame them, but rather to help expand the understanding of what that life was like. And so this sharing has to be on the terms of the survivor. And we know that there's specific challenges for sexual and gender-based violence. And we saw this within Truth Commissions of South Africa, archives. We're probably all well aware of the gendered bias that occurs in these transitional justice and aftermath processes after an atrocity. But why it matters particularly to perpetrator studies is that the narratives told at memorials impact a lot of dynamics in the aftermath. So, for example, in Rwanda, a lot of the narratives placing blame on structural figures, on colonialism, really shapes people's feelings of culpability. And that means that it also shapes their feelings about perpetrators, re-entry and reintegration, which Hollie, we have here as an expert. But these narratives shared at memorials shape the way that people receive these folks in their community, their perspectives on violence, their perspective on gender-based violence. And so these can be really key to the peaceful coexistence after mass violence. Lastly, a lot of folks find that memorials should be these sites of truth-telling by perpetrators, truth-telling for bystanders, truth-telling for attorneys who fight on these cases, that for Rwanda truth-telling for about how important it was to have done a better job at finding remains, for remorse, and a lot of folks really, survivors in particular, said it's really important to talk about that truth, even when it's really brutal or it may cause trauma. And that what they mean by this is we have limitations in that sharing about gender-based violence may cause trauma in our audience, but telling that is really important to these leader processes of ensuring both that survivors of gender-based violence get the resources they need, but also understanding that can lead to peaceful coexistence in the future. So that's my short spiel. I want to make sure that we have maybe a minute or 5 minutes or so for Q&A for me, but thank you so much for having me. And I apologize, I have to leave early to teach this morning.
Thank you so much, Nikki. That was a wonderful and visually stunning presentation. So thank you so much. I'm going to be quiet because as Nikki noted, she has 5 minutes before she goes off to teach. We have a bit more time together, but I'll open it up. Does anyone here with us have any questions for all panelists, for a particular panelist? Feel free to unmute and to ask the question. If not, I have some questions I can ask, but I will be silent and see if anyone else has questions first.
I have a question for Erin, but if someone has a question for Nicole, maybe they should go first.
Good point. Does anyone have a question specifically for Nikki? Tim, it seems like Tim does.
I have a question for everyone, really. So maybe if I pose it, then Nikki can go first in answering it.
Renee also had a question. Sorry, Renee also had a question. I'm not sure.
It wasn't for Nicole, though, so I can wait. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Suzanne. Go ahead, Timothy.
So, I mean, unsurprising considering what I also work on, I find the all of these chapters really interesting. And also, I mean, this idea of complexity, which the first two papers were particularly about, what it raises for me is the question is, and I'm asking this because this is in the context of the Perpetrator Studies Network, what does this mean for these established categories of perpetrators, victims, rescuers? Do we still need them? Do we need to move beyond these conceptions? Do they somehow become redundant? Or do they still have some kind of significance? And from that, I think it would also be, I'd be interested to hear Erin and Myriam's thoughts on that. But I think also, Annika, it would be interesting to see when looking at it from a sort of a more institutional perspective, where culpability does have a different sort of connotation, how can we use these binaries or these very clearly cut labels and move beyond it? But also, and this is why I put my hand up already, I think it'd be great to hear your perspective on this, Nikki, from the perspective of memorialization, and how does these clear-cut categorizations help or hinder in the memorialization process? Yeah.
I mean, for me, these categories are very fluid, and I think that acknowledging that people can occupy more than one is important to understanding the complex dynamics of human behavior. But I think it's also important to be able to isolate behavior if you want to. So, for example, Hollie and I have we have a big research project on rescuers, and we eliminated people who rescued and killed because we wanted to isolate what made it possible for people to only rescue. And so I think these categories aren't helpful in the sense that if you want to have them be rigid, but can be helpful if you leverage them in certain ways to try to understand behavior, or understand if people chose to rescue a number of times, what did their choices look like that were different than the people who chose to rescue and felt like, they needed to perpetuate violence. And memorialization, I think that often these categories get really simplified in problematic ways, in ways that don't humanize perpetrators. And I think this is something that everybody here on this conversation can agree on. And that humanizing of perpetrators is really important in terms of, I think, reintegration, of stopping revenge killings, of all of these processes that are absolutely essential if you're going to have a functioning post-atrocity society. However, I think that one way those are sometimes done is by placing culpability on structures outside of the individual. So I think Rwanda does that in some way, but it's certainly more complex because putting it on outside structures also allows for aid and, a lot of other consolidating power. But I think it's a really important question and something to think about whenever we're seeing these memorials, and also looking at, I think it connects well also to thinking about like the hierarchy of victims and also a hierarchy of perpetrators. So thank you so much for that really great question.
Thank you, Nikki. Other panelists, just feel free to unmute to answer.
I can go ahead. I think it's a really great question. And I mean, I agree a lot with what Nikki said. I think it is important to kind of keep the openness to studying perpetration. I think that it's often marginalized, that there's often a taboo around exploring perpetration, that it's somehow politically incorrect to be understanding, the perpetrators of violence and what happens. And so I think that it is important to keep that analysis and exploration there. And I think that there's a tendency, and I've been guilty of this myself, of sort of focusing only on victims. And I can give you an example of in my own work of where I felt like I had a blind spot that was sort of shown to me. And I was doing work on exploring children who had been born of rape in northern Uganda. And the project that myself and my partners were looking at were the experiences of children who were born of rape and their mothers. And during the process of data collection, we were looking at, what were the life experiences of the mothers and their children. And when we spoke to the children, they kept talking about their fathers, who were the perpetrators of sexual violence. And we realized how important it was to be also including the views, where possible, of the fathers. And so we realized our own blind spot in doing that, and then turned towards exploring the realities of fathers and what they thought about notions of sexual violence of children and all of that, which was a really important piece that we would have overlooked if we had only been looking at the mothers and the children. So I think that exploring perpetration and the perpetrators and their perspective and how they see things can really help move along in terms of our understanding of the whole picture and the complexity.
Yeah, I also like the question a lot. I wrote my master's thesis about bystanders, so I'm very interested also in these categories. And these categories are not often used in business and human rights or corporate involvement discourse, but they are sometimes attached when the involvement of corporations is not so clear, so they might also be viewed as more bystanders. One example that comes to mind, also because we're talking about Rwanda, is a subsidiary of Heineken, who is accused of continuing to sell beer to perpetrators of the genocide who were drunk while they were doing the killing. And that's a situation also when I discuss it with students where the question is this a bystander that didn't do anything, or is this involvement? It's an interesting category, but also the victim category made me think of how during the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions after the end of apartheid had some special hearings on the roles of business, which is often invoked as something that shows how the role of businesses, there was some sort of accountability. But when you read what happened during these TRC meetings, it was the companies saying how much they had suffered under apartheid. So they were claiming to be a victim of apartheid. And this is also something that happens, for example, with companies who are accused of financing ISIS. They say, but we were a victim. We had to give this money, otherwise our employees would be killed. So the categories are used also in different ways and can be applied in different ways, which shows, I think, the ambiguity of the role of many businesses in these kinds of cases.
Anyone else want to add anything on that one? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for the question, Tim. And Renee, over to you for your question.
Sure. Thanks for having this event. I actually found out about it through a friend of mine who knows that I work on Atrocity. And so they were like, have you heard of this? And I was like, no, but I have that Oxford thing on my shelf. So kudos to you all. It's really nice to kind of put some faces to names here. My question is for Myriam. Myriam, you made a comment in your talk about children in particular being shunned after their experiences as child soldiers. And I was wondering, and this may be perhaps too broad of a question, but do you find that to be different from the treatment of adults, specifically children being shunned and adults not? And the reason I'm asking that is because the context I currently work on is Lebanon. And while many of the people who were fighting in paramilitaries entered as adolescents and sometimes preteens, right? They were adults by the time the war ended, and nobody was really shunned. The culture was just one where, like, okay, we're not supposed to talk about that anymore. But that wasn't quite the attitude. And so they kind of are this like funky middle ground between these child soldiers and adult perpetrators. So I'm just wondering kind of what you're seeing pattern-wise.
It's an interesting question. I think I don't want to make a huge generalization about, children versus adults, but I think what I can say in relation to children is that the experience of being shunned is so different. That if you're shunned as a child away from your family, you're left on your own to kind of make your way without any resources or support, access to education, access to employment. What I was seeing in the context of Sierra Leone, children who came back, and of course adults were also shunned, there's no question. But when I think back to, in relation to your question of those adults who were shunned and those children who were shunned, the adults could kind of make their way. They would travel to a new context and, build their lives in a new community. It was still dangerous and precarious, but they managed to do it. But what I was seeing with the children is that those children, because they had no resources, they had no sources of support, they would invariably make their way into the urban centers. And because it was anonymous, people couldn't recognize them as much, and made their way into slum communities where they, lived in incredible poverty and became, in a way, servants to older people who took control of them and exploited them in order for them to survive. So I think that being an adult and having more experience gives you more access to resources and ability to make your way. Whereas I think being a child makes you far more vulnerable, and your access to, livelihood, incredibly difficult. So I think that those are the main differences, and the ability to kind of work through also the implications of being shunned, given that they're so young and don't have the same capacity to, again, as I talked to as I said, around the experience of guilt, and working through some of the moral implications of what they did and the moral implications of being shunned, less likely to be able to kind of do that as a child versus as an adult. So those are some of the differences that I see.
Thank you, Myriam, and thank you, Renee. Did anyone else have anything to add on that question? All right, and there was one other question, I believe. I missed who said they had a question, but there was an additional question someone had wanted to raise, correct?
I had a question for Erin.
Perfect, please go ahead.
Yes, it relates to the interesting remark that you made about how these labels of victims and perpetrator can cause emotional damage and make the lives of the people who are labeled more difficult. And this made me think of maybe the reverse of this, or made me think about resistance of letting go of these labels. And the reason I'm thinking about this, that we had a little we had a discussion here in the Netherlands, or mostly in Amsterdam actually, because our local resistance museum announced that they would no longer be speaking of resistance heroes, they would be speaking of resistance people. And the societal backlash was huge. Well, huge, I mean, in the under the parameters that we usually have people interested in what the Resistance Museum is saying. And I found it so interesting that people apparently were so attached to this label. And I wonder if maybe that also can happen on a societal level with the other labels. And yeah, whether you can say something about that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Annika. And actually, yeah, in a way, kind of dovetailed a little bit with what with the question that Tim put to us as well. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I'm often referring to when I talk about this idea of like a complex political actor being controversial, right? Is, yeah, I mean, in the Rwandan context, there is a lot of potential for backlash like that, where you sort of talk about, well, okay, let's not look at these strictly delineated categories of survivor, perpetrator, combatant, and so on. And, you know, especially where they carry these moral judgments, and let's just go with a general term and look at everybody on their own merits. I mean, politically, these labels, they have a great deal of value. And there are also people generally in society, I mean, and this is something I think in Rwanda I've noticed, especially with youth, like these labels have a lot of meaning to them. To be able to say, you know, that my father is a heroic combatant, right? Or, you know, like my mother is a genocide survivor, and like everything that comes along with that. There's moments where not only can it bring people a great deal of pride, but it can also open up opportunities for them, right? Scholarship opportunities for the children of genocide survivors and these kinds of things. So yeah, I mean, this is something I was thinking about as well in relation to Tim's question. It was just, I couldn't quite figure out how to articulate it. I think the social and political importance of these terms is something we can't forget. But then at the same time, yeah, there are going to be these moments. There are people for whom they're really, really problematic, and they add to the distress that they live with in the aftermath of genocide in ways that can be quite tangible for them, right? So, I mean, I suspect it's one of these situations where you can't make everybody happy, but what that means then for us in terms of, you know, do we go to one extreme or the other, right? And especially as researchers who are outsiders to these contexts, that's a really, really difficult thing to consider. Does that sort of answer your question? Great, thank you.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you, Annika, for the question. Any other questions that people have? Yeah, go ahead. Let's say Lucy and then Maartje.
Sorry, hi. I also have a question for Erin. I was wondering about how transitional justice processes might fit with the idea of role shifting, because I think even thinking about transitional justice processes or post-conflict processes that try to acknowledge a bit more complexity, the idea that they could actually acknowledge somebody who had done both or had been both victim and perpetrator seems very difficult to me. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kinds of transitional justice processes that could do that without requiring a lot of the individual, you know, to speak and to kind of put themselves out there, or whether the individuals that you spoke to had any kind of feelings around what would make them feel those role shifting moments were included in transitional justice, if that's even possible.
Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question as well. I think there are moments where some transitional justice processes can incorporate the complexity of people's experiences. Like there are moments, for example, in Rwanda with the Gacaca courts, where even as people were, say, being accused of having committed genocide-related crimes, they did have an opportunity not only to speak for themselves, but to bring other people in to speak on their behalf about individuals they rescued, personal circumstances, for example, being radicalized because of the death of, say, a father or somebody like that at the hands of the RPA combatants, you know, that like effectively a lot of the Hutu power ideology, the propaganda was demonizing in addition to the Tutsi minority, that kind of thing. So there were moments where people were given an opportunity maybe to kind of explain why it was they chose to perpetrate, or things they did that maybe meant they weren't just a perpetrator, they also tried to rescue. But I do think often, I mean, and obviously the memorials as well are a space where potentially that can occur. But I do think often, I mean, the nature of a lot of the big sort of trials and so on, the cost, the time-consuming nature of them, that kind of thing. And also, I mean, challenges around translation, you know, make it quite complex, right, to really dig into those nuances. And I mean, this might be going back to just what we're trying to do in a lot of trials, right? That maybe the way a lot of international trials are designed, for example, they don't give that same space to these complexities and allow for these kinds of discussions, right? Yeah, so I would say there's potential there, and I think there are moments where that complexity is maybe being realized in the courts, but it depends on a lot of external factors. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy and Erin. Maartje, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. My question is actually for Myriam, because I've been lucky enough that I've been working with Barbora Holá on a project on the intergenerational, transgenerational transmission of trauma. And I remember a little bit, you mentioned your work on women and their children, particularly in Uganda. And if I remember correctly, you also engage with the literature on the intergenerational transmission of trauma a little. And it seemed so complex to me because a lot of times the way you describe it, these children still remember the war. So even their sort of boundaries between categories of first and second generation, they become a little blurred. And of course, the literature more originates from the Second World War, where you have that clear distinction of post-war generation that doesn't have trauma themselves so much, or at least that they remember in the war. So I was wondering more in general how well you think that literature translates into these specific situations where child soldiers are involved.
Well, that's an interesting question. So do you mean, in terms of when you say child soldiers, do you mean like child soldiers who have come back and then had children? Or...
Yeah, so if I remember your research correctly, you mostly interviewed, I think, female child soldiers who had children, but then with combatants, but then some of the children were old enough to remember the war themselves and were talking about the war themselves. So that sort of really, blurs trauma experiences. Is it the trauma of the parent, or is it the trauma of experiencing trauma at a young age, if you know what I mean?
Right, yes. So I think in that situation, it's referring to northern Uganda, where in the case of young women, were abducted into the LRA and then were forced into marriage, had children. Some of those children, and again, it depends on age, because some of those children, because the women remained in the LRA for decades, some of them, and some of them remained only months. The children who were born were varied ages. So you had children who were living in the LRA up to age 10, so they would have a lot of memories, whereas other children were infants or toddlers and escaped with their mothers. So a lot of those very young children would still remember the escape part. And so I'm not able to make generalizations about, this particular population because their ages were so varied. But in terms of the general question about memory, because in that situation, those children, regardless of their ages, were shunned when they came back. So they would experience memories. They didn't necessarily understand why people were shunning them. And they grew up with this idea that they were children of Coney. And so they had to live with this ostracization within their families and communities. So they would have different variations of trauma, whether it was because of the war that they had strong memories of living in the war, or afterwards being living the ostracization because of their mothers and because of their own experiences. I would say, in relation to the question about whether the intergenerational trauma literature applies, I would say it's such a vast literature on so many different contexts, and it's a very rich literature. I would say that there are pieces that absolutely would apply. I think a lot of the information and literature is somewhat decontextualized or very tailored to a specific context, like the Holocaust, for example, where it's looking at sort of second generation and is very specific. But I do believe that there's elements that are very applicable intergenerationally that we can learn a lot and draw from, even in these very unique circumstances around a context like northern Uganda.
All right, wonderful. Thanks to both of you. Any other questions that folks would like to raise? Okay, well, we are just about at time anyway, so let me first say thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to the co-editors. Thank you to these amazing panelists for such fascinating presentations. And also thank you to you all for such wonderful questions that generated such a robust discussion. We are so grateful. And finally, thank you to the Perpetrator Studies Network. I will turn it back over to you all to wrap things up and announce upcoming events. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was an absolutely excellent conversation, wonderful presentations, excellent discussion. This recording will, of course, be up, so feel free to share it widely, near and far. The network, I just wanted to point out, we have upcoming events in March. In early March, we will have James Waller talk about a recent book of his about Ireland. And then in late March, we're going to have Hikmet Karcic presenting his book, Torture, Humiliate, Kill. So, you know, join us for these events, look us up online on the website. And thank you so much for being here and for your excellent questions also. Thank you.